evening, ladies, gentlemen, opposition, and other curious listeners. The first thing I want to clarify is that no human being should ever be in a position of having to justify his or her religious beliefs or cultural history. Unless one does not have an utter understanding of a nation's religion, culture, and lifestyle, they do not possess any moral right to judge, let alone change its intrinsic belief. Nevertheless, this is exactly what the West is doing to the East, historically as well as recently. And who are we, the West, to tell them what is wrong or right without even knowing that ourselves? And who are we, the West, to tell them how to dress or what the diet should look like? And why do we, the West, believe that we are in the moral position to judge the way of living? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about the importance of accepting different perspectives, in particular, a tolerance for cultural relativism. To Western countries, it appears natural to have meals containing pork or beef on our menus. We judge Chinese people for eating dogs simply because we find these parts of the cultural diet or bizarre, inhumane. For Muslims, on the other hand, it would be inhumane to eat pork. Just as for the Hindus, it would be inhumane to eat beef. But we eat Chinese food anyway. Thai, Indian, or Japanese. We don't judge the sushi, do we? We only judge certain aspects of their culture we cannot understand or the Western morals do not approve of. What gives us the right to pick our preferences and steal initial parts of their culture? Adapt and then judge the leftovers. The original Hindu diet is vegetarian, representing the so-called ahimsa principle, not to kill animals to feed yourself, a non-violent and morally positive mantra to live by. Many Eastern countries tend to have a healthier lifestyle in general. For many of the religions, such as Islam, forbid consumption of alcohol or tobacco. Of course, you can never speak for everyone, but these countries have a good teaching that the West has not understood yet. And if we already talk about teaching, let's take a look at medieval Europe and the Renaissance. The Western countries gained essential knowledge in humanities and sciences from the Arabic world, including astronomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, and medicine. Without this knowledge, Europe would never have been able to develop the way it ultimately did. And we cannot deny that our Europe nowadays is partly based on Arabic heritage, and we should be grateful for that. So now we are telling them to stop improving after taking essential wisdom from them to build our own knowledge. Isn't that ironic? But instead of embracing the international diversity and the chances we have to learn and rise from them, we judge. We judge everything that does not fit into the regime of a Western stereotype. We try to reform them, and even worse, to make them adapt. We wonder how people could ever live in another way than we do. But isn't that what makes this world so unique, so individual, so interesting? Who would want to live in a univocal world? Who would even bother traveling anymore if you fly around the Earth and see nothing but monotony instead of colors? Wouldn't that be an awful waste of space? And still, mankind has not understood that different is not a synonym to wrong. A variation of religion, diet, or clothing is why we can call our world multicultural. Women get harassed because of the choice of clothing in the East as well as in the West. However, the difference is that women are not harassed by their kind, their nation, but only by the West. For women in Europe during the Middle Ages, it was natural to wear head clothing. In the 60s, headscarves were trendy and stylish. It was fashion. But many Muslim women nowadays, living in Western countries, wear a hijab as free choice, as a symbol for their religion and culture. They don't judge or comment on people wearing a necklace with a cross. So why the other way around? We, the West, creates an image of the Eastern countries that is not veridical. And why? Because we lack knowledge in these areas and try to fill the gaps by our own interpretation. Let us extend our horizon by listening more carefully, showing respect to our cultures, different from our own, and not imposing a moral viewpoint onto others. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I will now call upon the opening speaker for the opposition.
Hello, my comrades and I will discuss why Western countries do have a moral right to tell non-Western countries how to behave through human rights, environmental issues, national sovereignty, and through religion and culture. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History can never be changed, and Western countries have made mistakes. However, that gives them the advantage to help other countries by preventing the repetition of previous mistakes. If the Western countries interfere before a conflict gets out of hand, there's a higher chance of preventing another drastic event. The universal human rights made by United Nations declares what a majority of the people believe to be the rights that all humans are entitled to. These rights were not enforced on people, but agreed on by government representatives around the world. Is a strong government worth it if all the people are sick? We live on the same planet, and we need Western countries who are the leading force to finding alternative methods of environmental issues, and the non-Western countries to work together to fix environmental issues. The Kyoto Protocol is an example of an international treaty that is trying to reduce the use of greenhouse gas emissions. Working alone can and usually does lead to catastrophe. The League of Nations was the first attempt to ensure peace amongst the country, but the League was too timid and did not interfere when Hitler took Czechoslovakia, resulting in World War II. The United Nations is a newer, more developed version of the League of Nations by understanding the League of Nations' mistakes and adapting themselves. The United Nations may be the organization trying to enforce national sovereignty, but almost all the countries that are members are the ones that must work together to fix and improve issues. The people's will is stronger than the government. If the government cannot respect and enforce the population's will, it is a violation of human rights. The West have adapted their culture because of the many cultures and religions they have accepted. Western governments give their people the freedom to religion and expression without it interfering with political relations. A theocratic government acts through religious beliefs, which can cloud political judgments that could provide a better outcome if the theocratic government evolved and looked at other perspectives, not based on if a certain country believes in a national religion. In 1979, the president of Iran tried to make Iran secular to modernize it. He was supported by Western countries. When that president was replaced with a theocratic leader, he turned Iran into a theocratic government and had the highest number of death punishments in the world. Some Middle Eastern countries are ruled with male domination to the extent that women need a written permission by the men of whatever they do. Malala Yousafzai acts as a voice for girls who deserve the right to education, but are denied to them by the Taliban. No matter what country one lives in, what government one is ruled by, what religion or culture someone lives under, no individual should ever be denied the right to expression, education, or religion. It may be the Middle Eastern culture and religion to have male dominance, but that does not give them the right to gun down anyone who defies them because they want to express themselves. The Western countries do have a moral right to assist non-Western countries because although a huge number of non-Western countries have ratified the universal human rights, not all uphold its values and therefore need the Western involvement. The Western countries are also the leading forces to finding alternative methods to fixing environmental issues, and should collaborate with non-Western countries to fix those issues. And for the sake of national sovereignty, all the countries must work together to prevent historical mistakes from happening again. The Western countries also have a higher tolerance of other cultures and religions, as long as it does not interfere with public safety and universal human rights. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to oppose this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call upon the second speaker for the proposition.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and the opposition. Now, let's think about Western countries and what they have done to human rights and how they have immensely violated them. Human rights is an intrinsic right. Let's begin by using an example that violated Article 9, known for entertainment, which states that nobody has a right to put us in prison without good reasons and keep us there, or to send us away from our country. This was violated during the Iraq War due to the fact that US guards preempt terrorist attacks by locking Iraqi citizens up without proof. Ladies and gentlemen, is this acceptable? However, not only this right was violated, but Article 5, torture, which articulates that nobody has a right to hurt us or torture us. This right was violated because guards used torture to get information from the prisoners. These violations in Abu Ghraib include physical and sexual abuse, torture, rape, and murder. The administration of Bush attempted to portray the abuses as isolated incidents, not indicative of general U.S. policy. This was contradicted by humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross Agreement, or so-called Geneva Convention, to protect victims of international and internal armed conflicts. Also, Amnesty International Agreement, which was to conduct research and generate action to prevent and end grave abuses of human rights, and to demand justice for those whose rights have been violated, and Human Rights Watch. After multiple investigations, these organizations stated that the abuses at Abu Ghraib were not isolated incidents, but were part of a wider pattern of torture and brutal treatment at American overseas detention centers, including those in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo Bay. There was evidence that authorization for the torture had come from high up in the military hierarchy, with allegations being made that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had authorized some of the actions. It could be arguably that terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS were both created due to the Iraq War. Let's move on to Article 2, discrimination, which articulates that this right belongs to everybody, whatever our difference. Now let's use a quote from Donald Trump. When Mexicans send its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're sending people who have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. This is a speech from a potential president of the USA, discriminating Mexican people. Or, no, how Donald Trump called them the Hispanics. Donald Trump also mentioned building a wall and making Mexico pay for it. Another example from Donald Trump is that he does not want to allow Muslims to enter the country since he feels concerned about a possible terrorist attack.
Point of information?
No. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if the Iraq was not enough, let me remind you of the Vietnam War. This one of the most horrific incidents of violence against civilians during the Vietnam War. A company of American soldiers who brutally killed the majority of the population of the South Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai in March 1968. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you to not make an emotional decision on the debate tonight, but a rational one, ladies and gentlemen. So I hope you decide wisely, with a proper discernment and a very good judgment that the opposition is representing emotional arguments due to the fact that they want to protect these bad decisions made by Western countries. I'm not against Western countries, but I am against government making bad decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Human rights are at the foundation of our society and are necessary for the permanency of peace, justice, and freedom. What does this mean to us? This means that you all have freedom of choice and are all free to choose your destiny. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is what ensures this peace and freedom, a document adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations and was ratified by the 48 member states in 1948. In Europe, we have witnessed the problem which can arise when these fundamental rights are not adhered to. Violent insurrections are part of our history, and we have observed the destruction of states, infrastructures, the destruction of cultural identity within it, and perhaps the best example of this concept is the Rwandan massacre. When two warring cultures, Tutsis and Hutus, resulted in total and complete genocide. The long and painful reconstruction necessary when human rights have been abused can be evidenced in just some of these ways. The effective adherence of human rights permits everyone to contribute to the growth of the nation and harnesses the energy otherwise used to repress for positive uses in its population interests. We can see this when human rights are respected by societies, resulting in the absence of such violent insurrection as those in Rwanda. How can we protect against these atrocities? This House does not believe the right way to change these abuses of human rights is through military aggression. These changes should emerge from within societal structure with peaceful influence from the UN. There are other ways in which change can affect laws and preserve culture. In eastern areas where help is needed, help will and can be offered. In the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Western soldiers' mission was to win hearts and minds, something they implemented with the building of schools, housing, and education for women. There are countries in the East where fundamental human rights are not protected. Two countries which do not adhere to these societal essentials are North Korea, where torture, degrading punishment, arbitrary detention, and even execution can occur. Even repatriated citizens, when labeled traitors, can be tortured and executed, with severe restriction of the freedom of thought, religious practices, individual opinions, and the expression of the individual. No. Human rights are abused to such an extent that there is a manipulation of information and even restriction of movement within the country as well as abroad, where practices such as the trafficking of women for prostitution, ethnically motivated and forced abortion, as well as the infanticide of children of repatriated mothers are parts of everyday life. We recognize this as serious and inexcusable abuse of human rights. Now, you might say to yourselves, this is what happens in North Korea, but this is an isolated case. Surely this is not that bad. If you still need convincing of our argument that Western countries have a moral right to tell non-Western countries how to behave, let's talk about the country that is arguably the most influential in the East, China. In China, the situation is equal to that of the North Korea. The corruption of the politicians as well as the judiciary system and discrimination against countercultural movement permeates the society and political climate in this country. An example of this level of discrimination and lack of adherence to basic human rights is evidenced by the following: the bloody harvest, where the extraction of vital organs are taken from prisoners of a discriminated minority without their consent, in violation of China's own laws. Did I mention that are often still alive when these nightmarish procedures take place? We know societal differences exist, but as you can see, it is necessary to overcome them in order to protect and uphold basic and fundamental human rights, something we all have right to, and something the West should and can influence the East to adopt. Thank you.
For the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, university staff, good evening and welcome to our debate. Environment has been at risk for decades. However, for the majority, the responsibility for that has been placed upon the non-Western countries. One might consider that due to the increase in innovation and modernization of China, it has led to disproportionate escalations in air pollution. But ask yourself, is all the waste that is found in the developing world their fault? According to the Quartz online article, Americans do not recycle the plastic, but export it for more than $500 million a year, which goes to China. A senior Chinese official has repeatedly asked foreign embassies to stop issuing air pollution readings, saying it was against the law and diplomatic conventions. Another example can be shown in the export of nuclear leftovers to Africa, which in addition drastically affects the environment in which the citizens live daily. We know for certain the US has been very reliant on the majority of electronics, chemicals, machinery, fashion, and houseware that is currently being exported from countries like China, Japan, and Korea, as it has been confirmed by the United States Census Bureau. According to this, we may conclude that non-Western nations do not act in a way which goes against the natural interest, and therefore we should, as Western people, not prevent their industries from growing in a normal way.
Point of information.
No. As previously mentioned, the import of nuclear leftovers to Africa causes drastic effects not only on the environment of a country, but also on the overall economy, which prevents the country from developing. Potentially, it completely destroys the farming soil by disposing garbage and nuclear waste, which builds diseases and generally undermines the focus of the country to develop.
it may result in unpredictable costs as the natural resource occurs. One simple example is also seen in Africa and is mostly known as the trade in blood diamonds, or in other words, conflict diamonds. According to the Global Witness, it is a term used for a diamond mined in war zone and sold for the purpose of financing an insurgency and invading armies' war efforts and or warlords activity. We can see how more developed countries from the West are manipulating undeveloped countries for profit, while the revenue they provide is very minimal. Many even work for free. As a result, it does not allow one's country to develop and gain the right revenue in order to modernize itself. As I have previously stated, learned members of this great university, Western countries should not influence non-Western countries. In the current context, because this influence has been largely determinal to those societies and countries affecting their distinct beliefs and social norms. When you take a closer look at Russia's anti-gay position, one might easily reach a similar conclusion, as Russia has been described by some Western commentators as an intolerant and homophobic country. Ladies and gentlemen, for many years, Western had the same conflict as to whether or not they should provide the rights for the gay minority, and even though they have now provided them with these rights, it is by no means certain that these rights have won without any opposition. No, one example of this can be observed in the recent crisis within the Church of England over the issue of gay marriage. It has rejected the gay marriage in church due to the threat from African primates, leaders of the church in Africa, which was one of the major events in the year of 2016. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying gay rights should not be allowed. Everyone deserves freedom of expression. However, the Western governments should not force morality on others until the non-Western countries are ready to accept them calmly. While the West is liberal, we're most certain that non-Western countries are more conservative, and to an extent, I believe that we should be more tolerant towards non-Western countries. Historic social conventions within Russian society are largely connected to extended family. This tradition of ideal extended families consisting of all family members respecting each other as the most valuable resource of aid, love, and care. As the Russian government explained, for the purpose of protecting children from the denial of traditional family values. Our opinion, therefore, is based on this assumption that no country should affect the sovereignty of another, especially in relation to their moral, social, or religious norms. Ladies and gentlemen, I therefore kindly and respectfully ask you to uphold this motion tonight and vote in its favor. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the third speaker for the opposition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our team, the opposition, believes that Western countries have moral right to command Western countries how to behave. On the aspect of environment, Western countries have been through more and is a leading force on the solution to the environmental issues. Nowadays, environmental issues are a very serious issue. Like global warming or deforestation, those issues are not something that can easily solve and take action. Therefore, environmental issue is a global issue that all the nations should face it and solve the problem collectively. Firstly, Western countries have more experience on environmental problems. They have been developed in the last few centuries, however, problem occurs. We have to face the fact that more and more environment are polluted and damaged. For example, the use of coal leads to acid rain, and the acid rain incident in Norway, in which the water body was negatively affected, and deforestation. Since 1970, Amazon lost 50% of the forest cover. Nonetheless, Western countries realize the importance and take actions to prevent environmental destruction. Thus, Western countries, due to the experience of bad outcome and the wish to unite and wish to solve the problem collectively, so they unite the other non-Western countries to solve the environmental issue. So Western countries support and advocate all many major treaties like the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international community focused on greenhouse gas emission. A total of 192 countries signed, and most of the Western countries reached the target. Secondly, Western countries not only have experience on the past, because of the emergent carbon pressures them to find alternatives, and they are the leading power of the alternative. Before figuring out the permanent solution, we can do something like reduce the consumption and emission. In EU, the coal consumption and production is largely decreased. In 2015, the coal consumption reached the lowest level since 1990, and the production rate is more seriously decreased than consumption. On CO2 emissions, statistics shows that the majority of the Western countries reduced CO2 emissions from the least 3% to the most 30% from 2000 to 2014 with the growth of GDP. In terms of permanent solution, Western countries are figuring out ways to get rid of dependence on renewable things, like using greener ways to travel instead of private vehicle. Our research in 2012 suggests that many of the Western countries are promoted cycling or walking like Germany. They are double their bikeway network to 30,000 kilometers in 1996. But generally speaking, transportation in non-Western countries are not major as Western countries. Like Africa, there's a lack of accessibility of transport to all the population areas while the population is keep growing. And thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon the final speaker for the proposition.
National sovereignty is defined as being the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power by which an independent state is governed and from which all specific political powers are derived. It is the intentional independence of a state combined with the right and power of regulating its internal affairs without foreign interference. Essentially, it is the right of a state to exist independently and freely. The West does not possess any moral right to intervene in non-Western states' development, and therefore it does not provide moral justification for thinking otherwise. Historically, the Western countries are experts at imposing their own ideologies on non-Western countries, plundering, destroying, and destabilizing them as distinct states. Right now, the top 5 poorest countries in the world are Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Malawi, Liberia, and Burundi. All territories becoming poorer as a result of Western colonization either by France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, or the United States. Furthermore, an estimated 12 million Africans were forced into slavery, and 80% of the Native American Indian population perished following the arrival of the Europeans. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the direct consequences of Western interference in the non-Western world. Nothing can fully justify these crimes against humanity, and I'd like to think that Western societies have evolved and renounced this white supremacist perspective. Western governments don't tell every state how to behave, no. Only those who interfere with their own agenda or those who cannot offer them something. The US and UK's decision to invade Iraq, according to President George W. Bush, was, quote, to disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, to end Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism, and to free the Iraqi people, end quote. The United States and the United Kingdom own a total of 7,525 nuclear warheads. They were morally not in a position to disarm another country or to take the role of the moral enforcer and free the Iraqi people when they are both at the top of the list of countries with the most nuclear warheads. The Iraqi government does not plan to invade the United States' sovereignty in order to liberate African American men from police brutality, even though on average an unarmed black man is killed twice a week in the United States. So, according to Western reasoning, it is justified to violate state sovereignty when people of that particular state are in need of freeing. However, they turn a blind eye when Israel expands its borders and builds illegal settlements, thereby restricting the human rights of Palestinians. Or when a Saudi prosecution requested the death sentence by crucifixion for a 17-year-old while refusing him a lawyer. Western governments routinely pick out whether or not they should violate a given state sovereignty based on self-interest. They need oil from Saudi Arabia, and they need Israel as an ally in the Middle East, so they allow it to slide. This completely discredits the West's position to tell non-Western states how to behave, as violating a state's sovereignty is not done out of genuine concern for humanity, but out of greed and narrow self-interest. The world does not revolve around the West, as much as they might think this is the case, but it isn't. The world isn't a playground for the West to play in however they see fit. The United States imposed economic sanctions on Iran because they wanted to, quote, ensure that Iran's nuclear program will be exclusively peaceful, end quote. This is coming from the country which possesses the most nuclear weapons in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not be hypercritical. If such a country can be threatened by Iran's nuclear program, Iran has the equal moral right to develop their own nuclear program, the same way Western governments have already done. Judging by what I've just described, Western governments appear to many non-Western and Western people as a greedy, self-centered machine which operates outside of humanistic concerns and should therefore, ladies and gentlemen, not be in a position to moralize over the non-Western world. Saying that the West has the moral right to tell non-Western countries how to behave implies the acceptance and enforcement of colonial, racist, and hypercritical values, which in our day do not constitute a reflection of progressive moral thinking. And therefore, I ask you, respected member of the audience, to uphold this motion.
Thank you. I now call upon our final speaker this evening, final speaker for the opposition.
Fellow students, Honorable Chair, my task today is difficult. I have to convince you that we should have the right to interfere in other countries when national sovereignty is threatened. I proceed. Let me start with yet another history lesson. As you all probably already know, World War I was one of the two most terrible wars we, the humankind, have encountered. It results in the death of 17 million people, a number no war had ever reached before. In order to avoid repeating such a disaster, the former US President Woodrow Wilson established in 1918 14 points that had to be respected in order to maintain peace in the old world. Amongst these 14 points, 2 are particularly interesting for us. Number 6, the allowance for a nation of self-determination of its government and its borders. Number 14, the formation of a League of Nations to guarantee independence for all countries, large and small. You see, the disregard of these 2 points in particular is one of the main reasons World War II broke out. Why? Because the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN, didn't have the means nor the power to actually enforce them. This is why Hitler could simply march his soldiers into the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia, under the pretext that a major part of its population was German. He didn't fear any retaliation, even though France was Czechoslovakia's ally. The appeasement politic led during that time prevented the French from intervening, and a major breach in the Czech national sovereignty occurred. Of course, Hitler promised that he would stop after this event. We all know how that turned out. What I am trying to show you is that if we act like this again, catastrophe occurs. We cannot just let a country claim another country's territory. We have to act. And Western countries especially have a moral right, what am I saying? An obligation to prevent such thing from happening again. Because they know better than anyone what happens when borders are ignored. Today, for instance, Russia is invading Crimea, a region that belongs to the Ukraine, with the excuse that a major part of its population is Russian. This may be true, and Putin even held a vote in Crimea in 2014 to ask the population which country they wanted to be apart from. And the response was 95.5 pro-Russian. But Putin still has no right to claim these territories. Don't get me wrong. The will of the population is the priority. I haven't forgotten about point 6. But in this case, the Crimean population was subjugated to constant propaganda from the Russians. It was intimidated and definitely not in a definitely not in a stable emotional state to make such a decision. Furthermore, Russia signed an agreement in 1994 in which it guaranteed the respect of Ukraine's borders. And yet, nobody helps the Ukrainians. This is also because we think that Putin will just stop there. We obviously have forgotten about Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Does this situation ring any bell to you? Hitler in the Sudetenland? I am, of course, not suggesting that we actually send armed troops, tanks, jets, bombs, and everything that goes with it and just like start a third world war against Russia. Intervention can be done in a much more subtle way. For example, by sending military supplies to the Ukrainian forces fighting in the home country. This is why the UN is so important. Because we need a higher authority that has an objective view and that respects the will of the people first. We need to debate, to discuss, to compromise, and finally to let the people have the last word with a vote where they are actually informed about the consequences, not intimidated. We should, for example, have intervened when China invaded Tibet, as we did during the Korean War in 1950, 1953. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I humbly ask you to reject this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both teams. I think this was an excellent display of individual student talent, dexterity, reasonableness, and intelligence. I mean, to amass all that information, to be able to produce arguments. A lot of